Hey folks, David Stewart here. Let's talk a little bit today about game design, specifically content gating. You may have heard this term before, you may have used it before in a whole bunch of different circumstances and contexts. I'd like to start by providing a fairly robust definition of content gating that I think will apply to a whole bunch of different kinds of games in a whole bunch of different kinds of genres and even with different monetization strategies, and we can see how this affects game design in total. I'm going to define content gating as a barrier between the player and access to some sort of content which requires some sort of action from the player. That's the robust definition, and I think once we get into the ins and outs of how this works, you can see that it applies in a whole bunch of different circumstances. The most common place that I have seen content gating discussed is in regards to MMOs, massively multiplayer online games. Games like World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy XIV Online, or Final Fantasy XI Online, or Elder Scrolls Online, or if you want to go really far back, EverQuest, Shadowbane, Ultima Online. Now we'll get a little bit deeper into how this affects MMOs as we go along, but usually when people are talking about this in the MMO space, they're doing so from a negative perspective. They're complaining about content gating, and this is something that I don't think needs to be universal. Let's go ahead and take that very robust definition and we'll apply it to a very old game. If you look at a game like Super Mario Brothers, Super Mario Brothers employs content gating. What's the content that's being gated off? Well, the levels occur in order. So in order for you to access any level past the first level, you have to have accomplished some amount of previous levels. There are things like warp pipes that will remove some of the difficulty of the game, some of the gating, if you will, of having to go through every single level and complete it. But, to access level 8-4 with the Bowser fight, you have to have completed the levels that come before 8-4. It's gated behind some sort of investment from the player. The player has to have enough skill to progress through that part of the game. They have to have spent enough time to get to that part of the game. They have to have learned enough about the game and its level design in order to progress through those levels and master them in order to reach the Bowser fight and rescue the princess. All of these things must be accomplished prior to the player being given access to the Bowser fight. It's a linear game. Linear games are really easy to see how content is gated. Most linear games do this kind of gating quite smoothly. The difficulty of the game increases steadily as you go through the levels, and your ability to play the game has to get higher and higher in order for you to gain access to each new level. This can be really satisfying. If you're playing a game like Castlevania, each level has a new color scheme, it has a new design to it, it has new monsters. There are new fun things to experience as you progress through the game. With these sorts of games, the main check or requirement the player has to go through to access the new content is a skill check. They have to get good at the game in order to see the next level. There's also other kinds of investments, such as time. The player has to learn the layout of the levels and learn the movement of new monsters in order to progress and see even newer monsters. And really everything kind of boils down to time. If you go far enough away, it takes time to build up the skill, so it's a time investment. And of course, we can't forget that there is a check called the price of the game. In order to have access to the content, you have to buy the game. Now, normally we think of buying like a classic game such as Castlevania or Super Mario Brothers or Mega Man, that when you buy the game, you get all the content, but that's not actually true. You get the opportunity to get all the content, but it still requires an investment from the player in the form of gaining skill and gaining knowledge of the game in order to progress through and see each new piece of content. But of course, that progression can be very fun. It's fun to have the new challenge. It's fun to progress forward. It's fun to see how far you can get in the game. That really is the nature of the gameplay. That really is the essence of these sorts of linear, say, platforming games, or really any game that has a progressive difficulty to it. This would apply just as well to games like Dark Souls. Now, where I think the concept of content gating gets really interesting is when we start applying it to contexts outside of these one-price, linear, progressive difficulty games. For instance, RPGs. If you're playing a classic JRPG like Final Fantasy or Dragon Warrior, there's actually a lot of content gating that goes on. As you move through the world, you encounter monsters that are more difficult. So there is a progressive difficulty there, but it's up to you as the player to choose where you want to go and when. So unlike a game like Castlevania where you're just going level after level after level, You in a game like Final Fantasy are exploring a map, and you may encounter a monster that's too difficult for you to defeat, and it may kill you. And so you have to reload a save game, and you have to rethink about what you're going to be doing. And that may require you to go around and defeat lower difficulty monsters in order to make your characters level up enough and be strong enough to defeat the higher difficulty monsters. So again, we have a control over what order the content is going to be done in. Even though we have a little bit of freedom with a JRPG like Final Fantasy or Dragon Warrior, we don't have total control over what order we're going to do the content in. It's still linear to a large degree, although there is more player freedom. We have a check in this case of not so much skill, like a dexterity skill required to operate a platformer, but rather a time check. How much time are you going to invest in making your characters level up before you move on to the next challenge? And this actually gives a little bit of choice to the player. The player can choose to grind up their characters and get them to a little bit higher level to where the challenging monsters are far less challenging, or they can choose to engage in very challenging monsters. And a lot of times you end up in this situation with JRPGs where you go to a new area, the monsters are too difficult, you go back, you grind a little bit, you come back, you fight those monsters in that new dungeon, they're a little bit easier, and by the time you get to the end of the dungeon, your characters have gained so much strength from killing those monsters that those monsters actually become very easy, in some cases trivial, and then you're ready to move on to the next area of the game or maybe the next part of the story. The whole point of having levels in an RPG is to control what content the player is going to do in what order, but at the same time give the player a little bit of a freedom as to how much of an investment they want to make in order to access that content. And the investment is, for the most part, coming in the form of time. There's strategy, of course, that's involved in turn-based RPGs, but we're really talking about a time investment in order to raise the stats of your character to make it so they don't die, say, in one hit to some new monster. If we are to transfer this to an MMORPG like World of Warcraft, we still have content gating in the form of levels. Each zone has a level range that's associated with it, where a character within that level range can expect to be able to kill the monsters either by themselves or as part of a group, and will be able to get experience from those monsters. And if they get too high a level, then those monsters are really not going to give them experience, and if they're too low a level, then the monsters will kill them. The whole point is to control what order and what zones you're going to go through in World of Warcraft. Where player choice comes into the content gating scenario is you may have different options for what zone you want to do. There's multiple zones within one level range. There's multiple areas that you could quest in or kill mobs in, and you can choose where you want to do those. Likewise, with an MMO, you can also choose how many people in your party you want to have. If you want to have 5 people in your party killing monsters, well, then they're going to be very easy to kill. And if you are going to go at it alone, it's going to be more challenging, and it's going to require more of your time investment in order to kill each monster. So a lot of the player choice comes down to how you want to invest. Do you want to invest more of your time? Do you want to have to deal with a group and split loot and things like that? What are you going to do? Are you going to attack easier monsters that die easier but give you less experience? Or are you going to attack harder monsters that give you a little bit better experience but take longer to kill? There really is a lot of player choice, but you are still accessing the content in a particular order. You're accessing it in an order that the developers have decided is appropriate for you to access it in. Once you get up to the higher levels, you have several other kinds of checks that occur in a game like World of Warcraft. You have a gear check. So once you get all the way up to level 60, in order to do something like the Molten Core raid or even to go to Blackwing Lair, you have to not only get to the highest level, you have to acquire good items, which means you have to do different things in the game. You have to, again, invest your time in getting the items that are appropriate for you to be able to take on Molten Core. Once you've been doing Molten Core and you get some of your tier 1, then your items are good enough for you to take on Blackwing Lair. All of these are different kinds of investments. They're requirements that are put upon the player for you to access the content. For you to access Blackwing Lair, you have to get all the way up to level 60. You have to get a lot of your epic gear or tier 1 out of Molten Core, maybe not all of it. You maybe have to get pieces of gear out of dungeon before you can get to Molten Core. All of that is a kind of time investment and to a lesser degree a skill check. And I'm going to bring up a little bit of a story here. Back when Blackwing Lair released and a lot of guilds were trying to get into that new 40-man raid, There was a skill check in the first boss, Razor Gore, that required you to kite all of these mobs around, and you had to mind control them and switch tanks. There was a huge skill check when it came to, say, hunter kiting, as well as coordination of an entire 40-man raid that simply hadn't been present in any of the fights in Molten Core or before that. A lot of guilds had a hard time getting past Razor Gore. He was one of the hardest fights in Blackwing Lair at the time. Once you got past him, you had another kind of check. You had Veil Straws, and that was a gear check. That was a DPS check is what they called it. Can your group do enough damage to kill him before you all blow up? That's really how that fight worked. Once you got past those two, you had a couple of pretty easy fights until Cro-Magus, and then finally you got to kill Nefarian. So in order for you to finally get to that Nefarian fight, think about all of the gating that occurs, all of the checks that occurred. You had to get up to level 60, which was a time investment. It was gated behind a time investment. Of course, you had to buy the game and pay the subscription, so there was a monetary gate that occurs before really you can gain any access to any of the content, plus an ongoing monetary investment for you to have continued access for however long it was going to take you to get up to level 60, get your gear, get into Molten Core, get the next gear, of course, maybe get your tier 2 helm off of Onyxia, go into Blackwing Lair, learn how to kite mobs around in order to get past the first couple fights, get even more geared, maybe to get past Veil Straws. Then you get a couple of loot pinatas in the dragons that are there before Cro-Magus. You have to learn how to coordinate for the Cro-Magus fight, and then finally you get to do Nefarian. Nefarian, of course, is behind lots of other quests that you've done along the way in World of Warcraft. You finally gain access to that content where you can actually fight him. And of course, first thing you find out is that he kills everybody that's not wearing an Onyxia hide cloak, so you have to do that. So there's a significant amount of gating that's going on in Blackwing Lair, and I didn't even mention attunements. Attunements are a kind of content gate. You have to do some sort of quest to get the attunement to Molten Core. You have to go get that chunk of the core and bring it back, and then you can go in to Molten Core without having to go all the way through Blackrock Depths. So you have to do a very long dungeon in order to actually get access to this very big 40-man raid. Same thing with Blackwing Lair. You have to do Upper Blackrock Spire, which is a fairly challenging raid to do if you're a fresh level 60, but it gets a lot easier once you have gear. So you have all of those things which prevent you from just accessing the content. Now, as time has gone on with World of Warcraft, complaints about content gating have become more pronounced. So one of the most common ones is, I paid for the game, I should have access to the content. And this argument is, I'm paying to play the game, therefore I should be able to play all of the content that is available in the game. But this actually doesn't work in any other game. If we go back to the Super Mario Brothers example, buying Super Mario Brothers does not grant you access to level 8-4 at all. In order to get access to level 8-4, you have to invest time in the game to figure out how to play well enough to actually get to that final dungeon and defeat Bowser. So no other game actually just gives you access to content because you happened to pay money for the game. But over time, these arguments started to have an effect on Blizzard, and we started to have a lot of the content gating removed. So we had a thing like Raid Finder, which just allowed 40 random people to get thrown into a raid, and you could see, I guess, a mild representation of the actual mechanics of the fight as they were designed. And of course, you get to see the graphics that comprise the inside of whatever raid you have there, but you aren't actually experiencing the content. You're experiencing a watered down version of the content, so you still aren't really accessing the content. An attempt to give people access to the content without them having to do the other checks which are required in order for you to gain access to the content really watered down the experience as we went on. Likewise, watering down the leveling experience, so there's less of a time investment to get to the end, makes the end less satisfying. So removing the gates made the entire experience more trivial. You also have problems with World of Warcraft where you remove things like attunements, those long quests that you have to do before you can gain access to a raid. And again, it makes the raid feel less substantial, more trivial, and you also are disconnected from what the raid actually is. Those attunement quests were really there to teach you about what exactly you're doing and why you're going there, rather than just stepping into a dungeon and being, this looks nice. You were supposed to step into it and know why you were there and what you were supposed to be doing there. So the gates that have been removed, mainly time investment and skill checks, have really lessened the experience of World of Warcraft. And of course, there's other things that have been kind of content gates in World of Warcraft, such as timed ones. They come out with a new dungeon, but only the first boss is available the first week. Then the second boss is available the second week. The third boss is available the third week. This is a very artificial kind of content gating, where you are spreading out access to the content over time and not letting players engage in the normal kind of gating process that they're used to, the normal checks that they have to go through, getting gear, getting skill, investing time. That's what people are really used to for RPGs. So in that case, I think spreading a raid out over 6 weeks, which is things that they did at various times in their history, that really feels artificial, and players definitely are in the right to object to that. If the raid is there, we should be able to get as far as we can in the raid before we are unable to get any further because we haven't passed the gear checks and we haven't passed the skill checks. Now let's move past this kind of content gating and talk about monetization of content gating, because this is a practice that is now very widespread in the industry and is present in almost every game that you play that has any kind of recurring microtransaction or ongoing cost associated with it, whether it's a loot box type of arrangement or it's a buying pieces of content one at a time kind of arrangement, or even buying expansions to something like an MMO or to a game, DLC. We're really talking about a kind of content gating that is hidden behind a money transaction. All content is hidden behind a money transaction, but there are more ways than ever that it's being done, and in some ways it's being done in ways that players are not even fully aware of. They're not aware that the content is being put behind some sort of money transaction rather than investment of time. Let me go ahead and try to find a couple of concrete examples here. The easiest one, of course, would be like MMO expansions. In order to gain access to the next set of gates, not even the next content, but the next set of gates to progress through that next set of content, you have to buy the expansion. But we've seen that in other things as well. There's DLC for games. In order to get these next little levels that might explain this character you like in, say, Dragon Age Inquisition or something, you have to pay $5.99 to buy the DLC. And when you are looking at the relative associated cost between buying a full game and then buying the DLC, you see that when you buy the full game, you're getting a huge amount of value in terms of the enjoyment and time spent playing the game compared to a $4.99 DLC that you get through in 30 minutes or 45 minutes or sometimes less, like 15 or 20 minutes. It's a really, really low amount of gaming experience for the amount of money that you pay. But this is not the only way that content is actually gated. There's also loot boxes, which may not seem like a content gate, but they actually are. For instance, if you want this content called a character skin and it drops out of a loot box, you have to then exchange money to get the loot box. Or what they'll do is they'll give you an opportunity to exchange a time investment for that, or a money investment. And usually the way they're going to structure it is that the time investment required to get that skin is so high that the monetary investment becomes increasingly more tempting until a player just shells out the dough to get the loot boxes to finally get the thing that they want. There are games that are entirely based around this, not just video games, but tabletop games like Magic the Gathering. Magic the Gathering is a kind of gacha game, meaning every time you buy a pack, you're getting a random assortment of things. Some things which you may want, other things which you don't care about at all. But your hope is each time you get it that you're going to get that good thing that you're going to use to play the game. So with something like, say, Hearthstone, what is gated is actually access to high-level competitive play, access to the meta level, if you will, of play. In order to actually be able to beat somebody in Hearthstone, you have to have cards. In order to get the cards, you have to open packs. In order to open packs, you have to pay money, or you have to do all of these quests and very slowly get enough gold to accumulate cards. The time investment required to get all the cards in a game like Hearthstone is tremendous, whereas the money investment looks comparatively cheap. Even though you're paying $80 maybe for a bunch of packs in Hearthstone, you're like, well, in order for me to get 50 packs, I'd have to get, 5,000 gold. In order for me to get 5,000 gold, it'd take me months of doing daily quests and months of doing arenas, months and months of doing all these things to try to acquire that amount of gold. That's if you're a very skilled player. So when players are playing Hearthstone, in order to gain access to just winning the game really against anybody, they have to start being willing to put up money. So the content called competitive play is gated behind either paying money or doing a significant time investment. And that's usually the way they set these up. You either invest a ton of time or you invest a ton of money. That's how they get you. That's how they get people to pay not just $60 for their game called Hearthstone, but $60 every few months, sometimes $60 per month in order to have access to the cards, in order to compete. So you're not even in this case buying cards to win. You're buying cards for just the opportunity to win, to just be at the same level as the other players who you're forced to play against. These practices have then been transferred basically to mobile gaming as a whole. Nowadays, it's really rare that you have to pay money to download a mobile game. Rather, the mobile game is free to download, but you have to spend a lot of money in order to compete or in order to see all the content. Maybe the content is super high difficulty. In order for you to get good enough units out of your gacha game, you have to spend your money to summon the right units of the highest level of quality. Then you have to pay money to level them up to the highest level to unlock their potential so that they can be the best possible unit, so you can do the hardest difficulty content. And I think over the long term, this makes for a very unsatisfying experience. First of all, you never really get to the end of the game. You don't get that satisfaction of beating the final boss. In fact, they'll never let you beat a final boss because they want you to keep playing the game habitually every day, and also to spend money on it every single day if they're really good at it. This is why I think returning to retro games is, in many cases, such a good idea. Retro games have that one price. You get everything that's there, and the only checks are the kinds that are fun as part of gameplay. You have to get better at the game, you have to invest some time in the game, you have to learn how the game works, and then you're able to progress through the game and have access to each little bit of content. Now, I also think it's worth talking about games that attempt to remove certain kinds of content gating. Perfect example is actually the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion. Oblivion had content that leveled with you, so your character did level up. It got better stats, more skills, access to more spells, but the game leveled up with you. So in essence, there was no set order for what you were doing as far as content goes. You could go anywhere and do anything, anytime you wanted in the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, and the game would give you an appropriate challenge that would match your level and your development with your character. The system actually worked pretty well despite people complaining about the system. A lot of people didn't like it when it came out because they didn't quite understand content leveling with you. They were used to regular RPGs where you had a set order that you could do things in, and if you wandered into a high level area, you'd just get completely smoked and wouldn't be able to do anything. Oblivion was a really interesting change of pace. It was also a game, I think, that had more immersion simply because there was no restriction on your movement. You could go wherever you wanted to. You could fulfill your whims. You could follow whatever course you wanted to. You could join whatever guild you wanted to. And you could progress through the game really in whatever order of content you wanted to, or do content in random orders, or do everything at once, focus on one area. It was really up to you, the player. Your player choice was really profound in the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion compared to most RPGs that have that linear progression of your character levels up, encounters new challenges, and so forth. There are downsides to it as well, which is that a constant level of challenge, or a very slowly rising level of challenge. As you get to higher levels in Oblivion, the game is supposed to get more challenging. That's the problem with the leveling systems. People are like, I'm supposed to get better at the game. It's supposed to get easier as I level up and my character gets stronger. It's like, no. What the developers were trying to do with a game like Oblivion is emulate the feeling of a progressive difficulty game, which most people are really used to, but have no gating on the content. You can do the content in whatever order. I think it was great, and I really thought it was very immersive that you could really just explore the world however you wanted to, and get the feeling of things getting harder, more difficult, more challenging as you went along. So that is my little discussion and lecture on content gating. Leave me your thoughts down below as to how you prefer to have your content ordered. Do you like to have your content ordered for you through progressive difficulty, or just a linear organization like a game like Super Mario Brothers? Do you like to have the player freedom that followed from games like Oblivion? Do you like some mixture of the two? And especially tell me what you think about modern mobile games and gacha systems that rely on monetizing the gating of content to such a large degree. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And of course, my newest book is called The Keys to Prolific Creativity. It's out right now, $2.99 for the ebook, and I will have more fiction coming for you guys shortly. I'll see you guys next time.